Recently, I've been thinking a lot about the grind in video games. In fact, I've been thinking about it way too much, and in a level of depth that honestly becomes depressing when you're just staring up at the ceiling in an empty room. So I figured it's about time I turn my musings into a video. Before I get into the meat of the video, I should talk a bit about what grind in video games really is. Grind, in fact, has a fair few definitions, including press or rub into a surface, the size of ground particles, and a dancer's erotic gyration of the hips. All those definitions of it are great, but for this oh-so-flexible word, we're looking at the definition of hard, dull work. It's one of the bleaker definitions, but seeing as sex is in there, that's not exactly a huge surprise. Grind in a video game is often completing the same or similar tasks over and over for an extended duration in order to receive some reward. Most large RPGs have a fair amount of grind in them. It could be that you are expected to spend time grinding for levels, acquiring XP to head to higher level locations, or you could be farming for legendary loot in order to boost your stats. The grind is something we can expect to see. It almost feels strange when it's absent in such a large game. How important is it really though? Why does it keep being included, and why do we put up with it? It's literally described as hard, dull work, which isn't something most people would pay for. In fact, most of us will engage in hard, dull work in order to afford a game which then apparently encourages us to do the same thing. It's a strange circumstance where we end up paying for repetition. We pay to give ourselves a task to complete over and over. Wow, this is starting to sound a little depressing, isn't it? Let's switch the tone a bit, get some slightly more upbeat music in here. That's better. Now then, back to the task at hand. Games often include grind for a variety of different reasons. The first and somewhat most obvious one is to increase the amount of time we play the game. If we play a huge game, then we expect to spend a lot of time in that world. If we can push through the main story in a handful of hours, we might feel a little cheated. If I were to spend $60 on an open world game, and I felt like I'd got through all of the content in one weekend, then two things would feel out of place. The first would be the fact that I was already at the replaying stage after such a short time, when normally I'd have barely scratched the surface. The second thing to confuse me would be why I spent dollars on it instead of pounds. I'm in the UK after all, I've literally never even seen a dollar bill in real life. Anyway, point is that we have a much easier time assigning value to time rather than pure enjoyment. If we enjoy an experience greatly for 5 minutes, then we might not view it as being as worthy of spending money on as something that we find passes the time amicably for several hours. The level of enjoyment is reduced, but the duration is increased. Despite this, my girlfriend still isn't satisfied. We seem to feel better about a lasting experience, rather than a fleeting one. It's understandable. If something's good, we don't want it to end. The journey is often better than the destination. I actually remember another YouTuber talking about how he didn't want to finish the main story of The Witcher 3, because then that journey would be over. All the time that he's still got more to do, it means it's not the end. As long as we're having a little fun, we're satisfied. It doesn't need to be the best thing in the world. It just has to last. With this in mind, it makes sense as to why we want grind in our video games. It adds to the overall time spent in them, and we do enjoy playing video games. Some other things we really enjoy though are power trips and a sense of accomplishment, both of which are rewarded to us through the grind. The power trip comes from the rewards we get after completing a section of the grind. After all, we're not doing it for nothing. We expect to be compensated well for our time. In coming up with this video, I spent a lot of time playing Final Fantasy VIII. I focused entirely on early game grind. I'd slay monsters for XP and AP, learn abilities that let me refine powerful magics, play cards to unlock various refinable ones to junction onto my now much higher level characters in order to boost their stats and abilities to a point where most enemies would die in a single attack and I could literally leave my computer in the middle of a fight safe in the knowledge I wasn't going to die. As a quick aside here, I understand that most of you will have lost focus a little with me rambling on about FF8 systems, but I just wanted to let people know that I've actually played fancy technical RPGs as well as the more straightforward and simplified ones I cover nowadays. Anyway, back to the video. By doing all of this stuff, I got my characters to a point where they were a far higher power level than the game really required. That in turn gave me a power trip. I was practically unstoppable, and would be for quite some time. I could safely go through all of Disc 1 without any need to slow down at this point, as I'd got myself far stronger than was necessary. This then begs the question of where is the sense of accomplishment? If I'm now one-shotting everything and have become an almost godlike being, surely that gets a bit dull. That's a good point you have, voice in my head. It can be somewhat dissatisfying to just wander around with nothing to challenge you. This isn't the sort of satisfaction that the grind is designed to give you though. We're all used to challenges at one time or another. Life can be pretty tricky, but if we all just work hard and put the time in, we'll be rewarded. That's what the grind tells us. It reinforces that which we've been told from an early age. Work hard and life will get easier. Certain games reflect this differently. Looking back at FF8, I can say that I know how the systems work in that game, so I know how best to approach the grind. Someone new to the game could approach it in the wrong way and actually end up making everything harder for themselves. Spend all your time focusing on XP and ignore the junction menu, and that game becomes pretty much impossible to complete. This provides a decent reflection to the real world grind. We all put the time in and try to succeed, but if you don't understand how it all works, you're going to have a much harder time. The more you know and the better choices you make, the further you'll be able to go. As an even more pessimistic view, we can head to Fallout 76. This game has a lot of grind to it throughout the whole experience. However, one of the biggest is when you've reached the endgame and start farming for legendaries. Legendary enemies will drop weapons and armour with special effects on them. The number of stars next to the enemy's name indicates how many effects the item could have. A 1-star enemy will drop an item with 1 legendary effect, and a 3-star enemy will drop one with 3 legendary effects on it. This obviously means you ideally want to be finding 3-star enemies more than 1-stars, however they aren't all that common. Most 3-star legendaries I've found have been high-level creatures in blast zones, temporary high-level game areas that you need to be incredibly well equipped to take on. Even with all this said and done, there's still the random factor to what legendary effects you get. You could end up with Nocturnal on a weapon which increases its power during the night but decreasing it during the day. This is very situational, and might not work well for you. Likewise, the item that's dropped is random. If you're a level 200 player and end up with a wood chest piece drop, it's going to need to have some pretty amazing effects on it to consider it over the much higher quality armour you've likely already got. The sheer randomness means that a player who spends 500 hours grinding could never get the item that they want, whereas another could get the exact drop on their first attempt. This creates a more flexible, but also more brutal grind, where players can easily get good equipment, but, due to it being randomised, will have to spend ludicrous amounts of time in order to get specific items they desire. At this point, I've played over 200 hours of Fallout 76, and I'd estimate that almost a quarter of that time has been spent trying to acquire legendary items for my characters. That's 50 hours of just pure grind, and in all that time, I've probably only got about 25 odd items that I've kept for any length of time. When you look at it that way, it can seem like a real waste of time. The thing is though, I've enjoyed it. The grind in that game has you exploring interesting locations, looking for both resources and dangerous enemies to face off against. It is repetitive, make no mistake, especially when everyone under the sun decides that the White Springs is the only place worth nuking. But that doesn't stop it being enjoyable. Anything you do a lot of will become repetitive, but as long as you take a break every once in a while, it shouldn't feel like such a task. Ultimately, it comes down to this. Yes, the grind takes a lot of time away from us, and we could spend it doing other things, but we want to be playing video games. A game without grind certainly isn't a bad game, but it's almost always a shorter one. Time may be a valuable commodity, but it's one we spend at the same rate no matter what we're doing. People may complain about grind every once in a while, but it's conveyed for a medium you enjoy, and the more time you can spend in a world you enjoy, the better. If you've got something you'd rather be doing with your time, then by all means do it. But if you want to participate in the grind, regardless of the reason, embrace it. Enjoy it as much as you can, and realise that it's always possible to love the grind.